Professor Greg Carr teaches Africana Studies at Howard University here in Washington. Today's lecture focuses on the issue of Maroonage, a method of resistance and resettlement by African Americans, especially by former slaves. The class is 1 hour, 15 minutes.
Now, let's continue where we left off, almost. We're going to tap into these texts fairly extensively this morning, but I want to start with a couple of things. Today we are going to talk in and around this topic. Anybody know what a maroon is? Runaway, to leave, isolated, right, runaway. That is the conventional, translation. It's from the Spanish, Cimarrones, because the Spanish called the folks who did this first by that name. I guess there's an obvious question that I want to set, and then I'm going to erase this, and we're going to begin from the beginning, come all the way down, because after all, the midterm is looming. The midterm is looming. Everybody looking so happy. We used to laugh in the morning. There's some laughter. All right, anyway, the point is this. When you're running away, what does that presume in terms of points? What does it presume in terms of who you are and what context you find yourself in? A runaway presumes what? Yes. Okay, there's a notion of freedom. Somebody said space, I heard the word. What's the spatial relationship that a runaway has? Okay, so a runaway, do we presume that there's a condition of freedom that precedes the moment that they have to run away from? Were they free before? So in other words, you think they were always captive? Right, so before there was captivity, there was what? Freedom, which is why, again, we have the argument with the name of a textbook that would say from slavery to freedom, right? You say from slavery to freedom, what does that presume? You are always this, right, which brings us back to the spatial relationship. And not only a spatial relationship, but a time relationship as well. So in time and space, when were the folks who became Maroons free? Before they were captive, right? We took it as a mathematical equation. So if we look at that and start putting chronology, we'll talk about genealogy and chronology again today. We've been going this over and over again. So chronologically, first of all, let's get the subject. The people who we're referring to as runaways in this particular context are who? Enslaved Africans, people of African descent, absolutely. So if that is indeed the case, then let's put a chronology on that. What are we speaking of in terms of chronology, in terms of dates? Let's talk about it in terms of centuries, roughly speaking. When does the condition of African people become one, largely in the Western Hemisphere, of enslavement, requiring some form of maroonage? 16th century, 15th century, so let's say 16th century. Okay, so we're talking about very recent. On our 24-hour clock, we're talking about 11 to midnight, the last 500 years or so. So if that is indeed the case, then the periods before that, the period of human history, the large, in fact, almost all of human history, is a period of this. And if there are forms of capture and there are forms of captivity that exist prior to the Western enslavement, they are not what we now call the so-called modern world system form. So yeah, so we have all this period of freedom, and then yesterday you have this period of captivity, and now we're still captives, right? It's subjective, isn't it? Depends on what you mean by that. Indeed, right. The fact that we hesitate, the fact that you can even ask that question and then have an answer that's complex speaks to the effect of this little experience right here. Little in terms of time and space, major in terms of the thing that we pass through. So, that having been said, let us now go all the way back and come all the way forward, because after all, this week begins our third framing question. So, before we even get to Maroonage, before we even get to this context, before we even get to, in Cedric Robinson, the last page of chapter 1, what page number is that? 2-0. Very nice. In fact, might as well read that paragraph out and then we'll come back to it. On this score, and on the score, he's talking about the rebellion, the resistance of enslaved African people on the eve of what becomes the United States of America. He says, on this score, the blacks, particularly the slaves. The difference between black and slave? Indeed. By enslaved here, he's talking about who? Those who, right, unfree labor, find themselves in some form of captivity. You mean there are Africans in the Western Hemisphere who came with or after the colonial folks from Europe, from Spain and Portugal, who are not physically enslaved day to day? Indeed there are. So he makes the distinction. On this score, the blacks, particularly the slaves, possessed conflicting opinions. And their conflicting opinions in this regard is with regard to the law. This is very important. Because here we are in 2010. And this happened yesterday in terms of a world historical arc, but it happened a couple of centuries ago and comes forward. Let's follow Cedric Robinson to his logic. The 5,000 blacks who fought for American independence, fought for liberty, and had a very different vision of national freedom than the one imagined by their country. Who is he referring to by their country? What does he mean by that? By right, the Paul Revere's, the John Adams. We know John Adams actually defended the British soldiers that killed Crispus Attucks and those cats in Boston at the so-called Boston Massacre and got them off because they were the police of the day. So, but he is fighting too for liberty, and so are these Africans fighting for liberty. But the 5,000 who fought for the Continental Congress and fought for the American forces, what became the American forces, are fighting for a different reason than these other folks. And by the way, at least that many fought for the British. And in Virginia alone, 30,000 ran away. Why didn't everybody fight for General Washington? Don't you want to fight for General Washington? He's the man, right? You to live at Mount Vernon, maybe one day go back with him? No, you don't want to fight. In fact, who are you fighting for? Who are you fighting for now? Yourself. Exactly right. This is the point. America is not a nation. It's a state with many nations in it. And it has always been the case. And one of the things that happens that is very, very, very difficult to explain to folks who don't understand the African experience in this country is that black people got different ideas about a whole lot of stuff, beginning with what this state means and what it is, right? We'll think about that in a couple of weeks when we have Columbus Day, which for us is a day off. Exactly. Very nice. Let's see. Very nice. All right, so we continue. The 5,000 blacks who fought for American independence fought for liberty and had a very different vision of national freedom than the one imagined by their countrymen. But as we shall see, many thousands of blacks would fight against independence, not for love of imperial Britain, but because they understood that black freedom was otherwise unobtainable. Meaning what? Right. You know who you fight for, man. Look, this could be really jacked up. Because if Great Britain loses, they trust these other cats, these Jeffersons and Madisons and Washingtons? No, in fact, in the Declaration of Independence, it says that one of the things that the colonies accuses George III of is stirring up insurrection among these groups. Meaning what? The Indians and the Africans. Now, I thought about that. Every time I went to Independence Hall on 4th of July and watched them read the Declaration and watch people cheer, including that black choir that comes every year. I'm saying, talking about you. Now that means, oh, that was a long time ago. Yeah, okay. Long time ago. But in terms of the sensibility and the attitude toward the state, I don't know how much has changed. Let's see. Like the Native American nations that sided with the British, the black loyalists sought to employ the British Army to serve their own interests for their own ends. Long after the defeated British had departed, their allies, the Native Americans and the blacks, continued the struggle for liberty. Now, this last couple of sentences is very powerful. For generations to come, Native Americans recognized America as a colonial power. You think there's still some sentiment like that? No question. And blacks read the new nation as tyrannical. Think there's still some sentiment? Yeah. Their suspicion of and opposition toward American society survived in the political cultures of blacks and Native Americans for the next, how many years? 200, meaning right up to now. We'll come back to that in a minute. It's a critical point. It's a critical point. The suspicion of the American state. Every advance that we have seen that American citizens have made, and now I want to focus primarily on the ones that African people have pushed and that America has benefited from generally, are accompanied by a deep suspicion of the state. That's why, in fact, this weekend I was looking at something and they had the Tea Party. There's no Tea Party. I guess they call it a Tea Party as if that's really something you can call a bunch of people. But there's this Tea Party sentiment being expressed in ways that combine it with the rhetoric of Malcolm X. And some folks say, well, you know, Malcolm X was like us. And if you think about it, that's true in one regard, a very deep suspicion of the American state. But that suspicion isn't linked to ultimately trying to build the American state. The suspicion is linked to the idea that the American state can never live up to its rhetoric. It's a rhetorical ethic. That's the difference between the Tea Party and, say, the aspirations of African people.
And when you ask any of them that, they don't understand the concept.
Oh, wait, wait. See, and they created the American state, and wait.
I'm asking, like, they created the American state, and when you ask them all a question, any of them, any random person in that's representing the Tea Party, you know, how do you feel about the American state? Why do you feel this way? Because you participated in it, you helped build it. Like, how can you be upset with it now? Like, did it collapse on you? Did your idea completely fail you?
Maybe it was never built. That's a good observation. The question of investment is very powerful. Investment speaks to the idea of a national identity. And when we think about the word nation from the Latin nasi, literally to be born, then we understand that there's a connection there that speaks not just to chronology. By chronology, the relationship of human beings to time. In other words, when did you get here? And so you ask somebody, say, okay, well, when did your ancestors get here? Somebody says, well, you know, my people from Ireland. Okay, when did they come? Well, the 1860s, 1870s, if they're back really far. And you ask somebody else, well, when did your ancestors get here? And they say, well, my ancestors came in the 1930s and 40s, moved into the Lower East Side of Manhattan, or the 1920s. Oh, then you ask some person of African descent, when did your ancestors get here? What's the general answer you're gonna get? Oh, no. And unless they are part of the subsequent waves, because the story of African life is the story of human life, the story of migration. But the most recent migrations of Africans have been migrations from Africa, from the Caribbean, from Europe, coming here. But if you talk about those who picked the cotton and did the indigo here in mainland North America, because our counterparts did that other parts of the Western Hemisphere, they trace back, most of them, to the 19th century. So many of the folks who are now part of the so-called Tea Party movement their ancestry doesn't go back far chronologically in the United States. In fact, not as far as African people. In fact, there was something on Cspan. Interestingly enough, congressional testimony right after Katrina, and there was a lady who was being questioned by Christopher Shays in the United States Congress, and Shays asked her a number of questions because her declaration was that what happened in New Orleans happened because somebody blew the levees. And then he kept asking her, well, did you see it? And she kept responding in eloquent Africana English or Ebonics. Ain't nobody alive to tell it who saw it. He said, well, did you? He said, ain't nobody alive to tell it who saw it. Well, did you? And finally, she looked back from around the microphone. You know how they had a camera angle, make it look like everybody's in. She looked back and said, where you from, Mr. Shays? See, I got 7 generations in my family on the African side. She looking at him like, you just got here. How you gonna question me as if you're somehow sitting in a seat of authority in a state where there isn't a nation? I refuse to bow down. So you know what he did? He just put his head down, shook his head. You can shake your head all you want. But see that one there, you questioning? Been here a lot longer than you had. So chronologically, that's one way of measuring the identity. But we're talking about genealogy at this point. When you raise the idea that there's a connection that folks who might identify as Tea Party folks have to the state that is not reasonable if you look at the amount of time folks have been here, but you have to look at genealogy. Chronology, the relationship of people to dates, to time. Genealogy, the relationship of people to an idea that binds people together. And for a lot of folks, the investment that folks may have in this country depends on what their genealogy is. There is something that happens when you get off the boat in New York at the turn of the century. Before you may have been Irish or Italian or be Jewish from various countries, whether it be Russia, Albania, wherever you're from, Poland, you come here and there's something that you get that you hadn't anticipated getting. You call it opportunity when you got off on the boat, but when you got off the boat, they say, look, you get this. What's that? Whiteness. And see, whiteness bonds you to a genealogy that becomes very much an investment. I mean, this is George Lipsis's work. Many people, but George Lipsis wrote a book called The Positive Investment in Whiteness. I mean, he's not alone. David Rodiger, a number of people have written about this. Whiteness studies is a big thing. That's why we have Africana studies at Howard, because we have to have a space where we can consider these things. And whiteness studies is part of, you can consider it a subfield of Africana studies in some ways, because to have a subject position that can see white, you have to step out of white as the norm. And white as the norm in many ways, and the investment of whiteness has become the prerequisite for judging American identity, which is why Maroonage is so important for us to discuss this morning. Before we can get to Maroonage, we have to establish again our framing questions. Because if we establish these framing questions, it will help guide us through our analysis. So yeah, people say, you know, they have this investment and there's this Tea Party movement, but if they looked at it chronologically, many of the folks who are now arguing for certain things in the Tea Party movement either weren't here when those founding principles were raised, or in many ways would have been oppressed themselves after all. In fact, what is the example in Robinson's text? He mentions it, and actually map 22 in Unit 2 gives us some great detail. What's the example that whiteness itself is not an idea that includes all white people from a class perspective at the beginning of the Republic? There's a rebellion, right? Bacon's rebellion in colonial Virginia. Bacon's rebellion showed all white people ain't the same. In fact, you see a dramatic upsurge in the enslavement of African people in Virginia, in part to localize enslavement as a black thing, identify slavery with black people. And to this day, that's what happens. In fact, how do we know slavery is identified with white people? I mean, with black people, rather. Because when you enslave somebody white, what do they call it? Indentured servitude. But right now, today, if somebody who was white was enslaved, what do they call it? White slavery. And that, you know what? This is obvious. Anytime you got to put an adjective in front of a noun, what does that mean? That means slavery is what? Not white. You got to say white slavery. It's like saying Black Jesus, Black Santa. Exactly. And you got to say that. What does that mean? No question. HBCU. If you got to see that, what is a college and university? So then we should have a little equality then. There you go. HWCU, HBCU. In other words, let's put the adjectives in front of everything. But the default position presumes then that this ultimately becomes correlative to non-white at least. Non-white generally and black specifically. But Bacon's rebellion shows us that whiteness has to be created. And guess what? Just like whiteness had to be created, you can lose your whiteness. Fool around with the wrong crowd. What's the brother in Chicago? Father Flegger? Cat gonna lose his whiteness, keep playing around. In fact, no, he's trying. In fact, I think he already gave it up. And the whole point is that whiteness is a social identity. In fact, I like the title of a journal that was published back in the 90s called Race Trader. It was published largely by people of European descent, and their motto was, they had the title in front of the journal, Race Trader, and underneath it said, treason to whiteness is loyalty to humanity. That's a good idea. I like that. Because white and human got to be delinked. And the Maroons did a lot toward that by simply walking away. So let's go through. We're at framing question 3 now. We know in Africana studies that methodologically we have to remove the default positions from intellectual inquiry in order to open up the inquiry. So we don't assume anything except the common humanity of everyone on the planet and the long view genealogy of African intellectual work. So the first thing we have to ask ourselves, y'all know these questions, so let's just go through the first 2 and then we'll empty into the third one. What's the first question? It sounds so beautiful. Let's say it out loud at 8:30 in the morning. 1, 2, 3. How do we understand study? That's so beautiful. Let that resonate to the 4 corners of the universe. This is what we do at Howard University. How, in fact, do we undertake the study? How do we undertake the study of the African experience? The first thing we have to do is come up with some framing questions. We ask ourselves these framing questions. That's where these questions came from. And then we come up with some conceptual categories that allow us to see humanity in its full range in general and African humanity in particular, because that's what we're doing in Africana studies, which is the study of Africa when and wherever you find it. using the modalities of Africa to do it. So, the second question we have, what's the second question? That's what I'm talking about. I don't know nothing about that. Confirm their way of life. Give me some chalk. How do Africans preserve and affirm their ways of life and use those ways as a means to do what? Resist. Resist what? Enslavement. So, in fact, the moment of resistance is not the formative moment of African identity. It is the context for using African identity. So somebody came here right now and put their hands on us and said, get out of here. We just gonna go with them? No, because we have a memory. And that is the prerequisite for human behavior. Memory, conscious memory. In fact, Theophilo Obenga, the great Congolese scholar, talks about history, historiography, and historicity. History meaning memory. How do you remember your identity as an individual, as part of a group? Historiography, how do you write that memory? How do you construct that memory and pass it on from generation to generation? And once you've done that, you have a sense of historicity, yourself in time and space. What's your vision for the future? There's a new film out now, Waiting for Superman. That's a beautiful title. Except Gil Scott-Heron saw that 30 years ago when he wrote a song, Ain't No Such Thing as Superman. I'm not waiting for Superman. Clark Kent, DC Comics or Marvel. No. When you woke up in the morning, you had everything you needed to succeed in terms of a brain. The context may have to change, but in order to resist that context, you must preserve and affirm your ways of life, not show up praying that somebody come and save you. I like the way Gil wrote it in that song. You was on the Nile. You went to see Great Egypt fall. And you was out there on the corner when being cool went blind. You alone understand that if we're going to win, we got to stick together, move together, stay together. The day you understand, ain't no such thing as Superman. Now, I ain't mad at anybody having good intent for the Negro, gonna help us, but let's be very clear. Here's the help. Back up. You know, you got some money to give, fine, but you know what? We got this. Why? We was on the Nile. We built and watched Great Egypt fall. We built Ghana, Mali, Songhai, Mona Matapa, Kadam Bornu. We raised the great civilizations, the Shona, the Dinka, the Noor. We raised all those and then got on some boats and built the West. Waiting for Superman? Yeah. Okay. It wouldn't be no metropolis for Superman to live in, except that those great cities were built on the wealth of African labor. Waiting for Superman. Superman was waiting on us. It wouldn't be no Superman. But at any rate, so the second question we have, how do we preserve and affirm African life? How did they preserve and affirm their identities and use those identities as a means to resist enslavement? This is the cultural logic of Maroonage. This is the cultural logic of Maroonage. And we're going to linger between questions 2 and 3 today. Because that third question now has Africans wherever we're going to be geographically on this side of the Atlantic Ocean. And having been ensconced in these places now, because this how do we begin the study of the African experience, gives us our frame. The preserving and affirming of African life, how do we preserve and affirm our ways of life, takes us from the origin of humanity all the way down to now. Because this last 500 years has been a period of resistance. And in fact, we might as well go on and finish our recap on that very quickly. So, how do we, before we get to question 3, preserving and affirming our ways of life presumes that we know those ways of life. And remember, one more time, as we go to, this chalk is so cheap, but it works. Cheap chalk. Stone Age technology. I believe in it. All right. Anyway, so this, of course, is our Kikongo cosmograph. So the Kikongo people, and they're not the only ones, but the Kikongo cosmograph has a, it's a symbolic representation of how the people in Kikongo, I'll write this quick Africa here with accoutrements and little things. The Congo people down here in Angola, a little bit north of that as well in Congo, a little bit south of that in Namibia. But the point is that the Kikongo people here had designed this as a visual representation of the cosmos. The sunrise, the sun at noon, the sunset, the midnight sun. And every cycle, whether it be a day, whether it be a human life, whether it be the life of a group of people over a period of time, follows in this order. And everybody who comes behind has the benefit of those who came before them getting that knowledge from them as they rejoin the ancestors and come back from the ancestors. So every one of these cycles we see go forward. And to finish the analogy that we went over again last week, we might as well finish it up by saying that if we take every one of these repetitions, if we take as a unit of analysis that 500 years, so every 500 years we say, we're just using this now as a way to kind of put some context on it, we complete a cycle and come back and complete again with the memories of the cycles that come before. And if every 500 years equals 1 hour, then the period from 1500 to now is 1 hour. And if we then take that 500 years for 1 hour and start and say midnight tonight is 2010 or 2000, 2010, we rounded up a little. And then go back, that means 11 p.m. is when? 1500. That's everything there. That's Columbus. That's everybody that comes this way in terms of the major enslavement of African people in the Western Hemisphere. So then what about 10 p.m.? That's 1000. There's no England. There's no England. But however, if we look at our maps, for example, maps number, let's look at maps 7 and 8. 7 and 8, what do you have in terms of enslavement of African people? Trans-Saharan slave trade, exactly right. So there are others involved in this process before Europe comes and says, oh, give me some of that. Some of that what? Some of that black labor. Europe comes back into Africa. I mean, well, I guess you really can't consider the Greeks and Romans Europeans. They only become Europeans in the so-called European Renaissance when people go back and invent an identity to give themselves, big up themselves. But Greece and Rome had been there, of course, many centuries before. But around 10 p.m., you've got a trade in enslaved Africans coming over the Sahara, which of course in Arabic means desert. So don't say Sahara desert, that means desert. But you can say that by 10 p.m., you got folks engaged in the trade of African people. But it's not England, it's not Spain, it's not Portugal. Yes, who?
But just like check it out, see what it's like. This might be a quick video, we'll just have a look.
Some of the Arabic folk, some of the Muslim countries, and there's contestation. But what happens is there are routes to trade enslaved Africans in, coming out of Sahara, coming off the coast of East Africa, coming out of Northeast Africa, going this way into what now becomes Asia, going even up to the lip of the so-called Maghreb, to the Mediterranean Sea, and then from there, other points. You see then the trade in enslaved Africans. So what Europe does is come into a process that had already begun. But it's only on our clock 2 hours old, meaning only 2 times around this. And for folks who start African American history with Martin Luther King, understand they're talking about the period from like 1158. You got 2 minutes of knowledge walking around. Can you imagine having 2 minutes of knowledge in your life? And not even a good 2 minutes. Martin Luther King, I have a dream. He gave that speech like a few weeks before in Detroit. There's a record. Barry Gordy had a little record company that he had on the side of Motown, and he pressed the speech. So, in fact, when I got my first copy of that album, I played it. I'm like, that's the same speech he gave. But if you know the black church, you know that black preachers don't never give a speech only one time. Negroes give the same speech, and some of y'all been to church, and you can tell this, hey, here they go. All right, you ready? Here you go. He's gonna talk about all day Saturday night, all night Saturday night, all night, and then early Sunday morning. And all right, you ready? All right, here's where he hits this one. Here he goes. Here he goes. Here he goes. Anybody see Eddie Long? Sunday morning. Y'all see it, right? Y'all watched him. I watched him when I was like, man, Bishop. First of all, when they start making everybody a bishop, that's a whole nother conversation. But anyway, we'll get there. That's about a month and a half from now, because these bishops on this clock go back way before 10 p.m. If you look at black religious tradition. What's going on at 9 p.m.? What time is that? 500, right? So-called AD. Meaning what? There's a lot of stuff going on in Africa. In fact, if we look then at our maps, you're not going to see, in fact, map number 3, Africa, its peoples before European intrusion. Map 3 is going to give us a glimpse of what's going on. Right? And it doesn't even name the major state formations, because most people in the world are not living in so-called empires or big states. They're living in villages, they're living pastorally, they're living in smaller arrangements. In fact, it only happened in this modern era, very recently, that over half the population of the world, or roughly speaking about half, lives in cities, as opposed to towns or villages or countries. But that's all right. You see, Africa, in fact, gives birth to humanity and then is quite well fortified and arranged on the eve of the so-called enslavement by 9 p.m. So we're not going to go, we've gone over this many times before. Let's just add a couple of, because some of y'all got in your notes. So if we take this 500-year increment and we go back, when did the pyramid, wait a minute, when does Greece come into existence? Between 630 7 o'clock. Okay, so somebody in the sheet comes up and starts talking about Iliad and Odyssey and Helen of Troy and Jason and the Argonauts, whatever, Odysseus or whatever you want to call them. That's very nice. Very nice.
So it's going to roll
Beautiful.
on, I take it.
When are the pyramids built?
A little bit, so we might as well end up.
African people build the pyramids about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Now mind you, Africa been up all day.
Swing jackasses.
So Greece shows up around 6:30, 7
Come
o'clock.
on, jump in there.
And then, around 8 o'clock, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him.
Probably should have named all the fire.
The noble Brutus had told you that Caesar was ambitious minded. If Caesar was ambitious, so 'twas a grievous fault and grievously as Caesar answered it. Never understood why, of course they were British. That's why they had to give the English accents. But the whole point is that Julius Caesar, that's an evening conversation. Black people been tired by then. When they built the pyramids,
My bad. I've turned off my TV.
Kush, Merowe, Bona Matapa, all these societies looking down. What's all that noise up there? I don't know, somebody in the attic up there fighting with cardboard swords with sheets on. All right. Y'all stop all that noise. But at any rate,
Well, looks stupid to you.
but this goes all the way back to midnight the previous day. That would take us back about 10,000
Wow,
years.
we didn't even get that.
And that would allow us to see
I thought that was perfect.
the African origin, not only of humanity, because that would go back days and even years before that, but just on this one day, if we take 500 years as 1 hour, you see the African contribution. Now, if we take this as a cycle then, the trick is to get as much of your human memory back
Perfect.
from these previous cycles, so that in coming to the next cycle, you can apply that human memory to solve the problems of how to stay on the planet, how to help everybody else
Turn the
be.
lock out?
That's the challenge. So we know then how we study the African experience, we get our framing questions. How do Africans preserve and affirm their ways of life? The first thing we got to know is what those ways of life were, because the resistance took place in the last hour on that clock. In that example, the resistance has taken place over the last 500 years. And when did the resistance stop? Different questions, right? Different kind of answers. Depends on what we mean, doesn't it? It's a complicated question, isn't it? Brother who just made his transition to great political science, great scientist, great political theoretician, Ron Walters, of course, on this campus for many years, asked in his very important book, Pan-Africanism in the African Diaspora, the proper question to ask is not when did black people become Americans or Jamaicans, or when did they become Ghanaians, or when did they become Londoners, or when did they become Brazilians. The question to ask as well, in fact, the first question to ask is when did we stop being African?
My swing is not too good here.
Question is we didn't. The answer to that is we
That
didn't.
was dead straight. That was okay.
Now, I'm not talking about taking a swab, getting a DNA test, and find out where your ancestors came from. But if Western civilization is an idea, why in the world can't everybody else have the same idea about genealogy?
Unfortunately.
Because it isn't mutually exclusive. It's both and. It's not either or. So let's continue. So then what we see then is what are some of the similarities and differences in practices of self-determination of Africans in the United States and their counterparts throughout the Western Hemisphere? By the time we get to that point, Africans have, in fact, let's look at our map book. Let's do our map thing right quick. Map thing. Map thing. All right. That 11 to midnight, we covered that on map 7 and 8. The West creates itself in many ways. Map 10. What's map 10?
This is definitely going to be more difficult because
Yes.
we're going to be hitting driver here.
Thank you. The expulsion, in fact, of the Moors from Portugal and Spain, and Portugal's exploration of the African coast. So, who's first out of the gate in terms of, wait a minute, let's get this here. We got our questions down, and we know that there are 6 of these. Uh-oh, I'm about to mess up.
Oh, yeah.
About to mess up, man.
Red, is it? Jesus, it's miles.
What should I do first? I should probably put the conceptual categories up so we can be clear about that. Okay, let's do that, and then we'll go forward. What's our, and now, of course, Africana Studies requires us to have conceptual categories that allow us to ask questions about the human experience that we can apply to any moment in whichever of these cyclical moments we're talking about. So these are the 6 questions we always ask ourselves, generally, and about African people in particular. What's the first category? What is the social structure? What is the social structure for the period we are analyzing? And by social structure, we simply mean what is the context in which people have organized themselves, that African people find themselves in at that moment. All right, what's the next one? Governance. The question becomes, how do the African people we are analyzing in that moment, how have they organized themselves? So prior to that 11 to midnight hour on our metaphorical clock, prior to 1500 to the present, the vast majority of African people will have these 2 things as the same. Why?
Because that was just a little bit too far.
Because they're living where? in their own social structure. But then when you see African people transported into another social structure, this is why you don't say black people were slaves. No. People of African descent found themselves in a system of enslavement. That's the system, not the people.
Yes, kick on, get there.
That's why you don't go from slavery to freedom. You can go from slavery to freedom if you understand that those are social conditions created by a social structure, as long as you understand the people going from slavery to freedom are human beings and never stop being human beings. Human beings don't wait for Superman, because ain't no such thing. Superman is a construction of a social structure that doesn't even recognize that people have a governance structure. Think Superman can get up and preach a sermon in the church? Superman, first of all, dude, you don't know nothing about this. Hold on. This is our thing. Go back over there and fly off a building or something else. All right, social structure, governance structure. What's the next question you ask? What are the ways of knowing? Ways of knowing. This is very important. Ways of knowing are critical to understand for African life. For human life. But then these people who got on these boats, who found themselves in enslavement, had ways of viewing the world that made their way over here. In fact, let me stop right here and give us an example of that. Let's go to chapter 2, to the beginning. There is a quote. There is in fact a quote. My goodness. Somebody writing to somebody else on page 21. Slavery and the Constitutions. Who wants to read that out loud? Who can read? Y'all can read it? All right. I'm going to give everybody a second to get their mind right. We can receive the word from Benjamin Banneker to Thomas Jefferson. Please, loud and clear, everybody can hear.
Sir, suffer me to recall to your mind that time in which the arms and tyranny of the British Crown were exerted with every powerful effort in order to reduce you to a state of servitude. Here was a time in which your tender feelings for yourselves had engaged you thus to declare. You were then impressed with proper ideas of the great violation of liberty. But sir, how pitiable is it to reflect that although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, that you should at the same time counteract his mercies in detaining by fraud and violence so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves.
Brilliant. Who did that?
Benjamin Banneker and Thomas Jefferson.
Benjamin Banneker, to that dude standing up over there on the tidal basin with the monument, Jefferson. Where is the Banneker monument? See? At the high school. Now, we do know, though, what is the function of history and historiography? To give you historicity, a vision for the future. Instead of Banneker High School, there's Banneker High School across the street, right? Those young people came over here on Friday, some of them to come see Dr. Ben Carson. They always come to convocation. They always come to Charter Day. That's a beautiful thing. Put a pistol to somebody's head and say, I'm afraid I'm going to have to blow your brains out if you can't tell me more than one sentence about Benjamin Banneker. How many might die? Because it's the lack of historical memory that doesn't allow us to put these things in context. I ain't mad at Thomas Jefferson. Well, I do got beef with him, but it's all right. I was at the Jefferson Memorial last week. I go down there a lot to read the words and watch the people who come to take pictures in front of Thomas Jefferson, oblivious to the context in which this man did his due in every way that you can think of. The whole point of Banneker, Benjamin Banneker's grandfather. In fact, Ronnie Glass wrote an article about, Glass, you told me I might want to look it up. Ronnie Glass wrote an article about 10, 11 years ago, well, 1997. And the journal's called The African Heritage of Benjamin Banneker. He's talking to Silvio Bedini, who actually wrote the book on Benjamin Banneker, the biography. And what they discovered and what Glass went and did, Ronnie Glass, is he actually went to Africa, went to Senegal, tracing Benjamin Banneker's roots. Benjamin Banneker, this is from Maroonage right here. Banneker, this name right here came from Africa. Benjamin Banneker's grandfather was enslaved. He was bought by some folks, and the white woman who had paid for him and one other person tried to enslave them. This is what Banneker's granddaddy told him. I'm royalty. I'm not going to be a slave. And I'm not converting to Christianity. For real? But I paid for you. Whatever. Seriously, this is what happened. Banneker's grandfather said that to the white woman who had him enslaved. They said, I ain't gonna be no slave. So you know what she did? I'm sorry. Banneker's grandfather, best guess of the scholars, won off. This is Howard University, so I'm assuming there's somebody here who got some family or who have been Senegal, right? some Senegalese folks in here. Y'all get that DNA swab. Some of y'all from, though. Wolof. The Wolof, by the time of the 16th century, their African spiritual traditions had also been blended with what particular global spiritual tradition, faith tradition? Islam. You guys are Muslim, probably. I'm not converting to Christianity. Just after they could learn to talk to each other a little bit. So what happened? You know what she did? She paid off the debt that she had incurred to get them, freed them, then married the dude. Come on! I ain't never seen a movie of that. I'm asking that's not true. Ozzie Davis did a movie many years ago on Benjamin Banneker. But I mean, are you serious? So Banneker's grandmother is the white woman that had his grandfather enslaved because the boy was like, nah, I'm sorry. In fact, I see you looking at me. I see you checking me out. This is a true story. It's a true story. Their daughter then married a dude who had been enslaved on the so-called Guinea Coast, somewhere between now modern-day Ghana and Nigeria. What does this have to do with Banneker? What does it have to do with what he wrote that you read so eloquently? Banneker had a memory of his grandfather that had been passed down through his genealogy. He knew the stories of his grandfather. In fact, what Iglas shows is that, at least in terms of geometry and numerical computation, Banneker shows in his work the African origins of his computational logic. So Banneker's not writing Thomas Jefferson from a subject position. He's like, dude, you believe in God? For real? How pitiable is it? He didn't say have pity on me. I'm not waiting for Superman. You know what he said? He said what Fannie Lou Hamer said in 1964 at the convention in Atlantic City, the Democratic National Convention. Here's this one from Rouville, Mississippi. And so she's a poor sharecropper. Whatever. I'm sitting in the same kind of room testifying before this Congress that Ma D, that lady I told you about earlier, was sitting in with the Katrina hearing. And she looked up and she said, you know what? Is this America where you can't sleep at night without having your telephone off the hook? You know what? I question America. Who are you to question America? I'm sorry? You know how many generations I got in on this side of the Atlantic? Not to mention the fact I'm the mother of civilization. I question America. And you know what they did? They backed up off Fannie Lou Hamer. In fact, no Fannie Lou, no Barack Obama. Let's be very clear about it, right? What do you say, Mother? Let's be clear. Because it was the response to Fannie Lou Hamer and the Democratic Freedom Party of Mississippi in 1964 that led the Democratic Party to open up the party to allow other kinds of delegates, which eventually led to the insurrection led by Jesse Jackson in the mid-'80s, masterminded by Ron Walters, that forced them to change the rules again that led to Bill Clinton. And then, of course, Barack Obama. But that ain't the point. The point I'm trying to say is this subject position. I ain't no slave. I know what you talking about. And Banneker is saying to him, how pitiable is it, my man, to reflect. Now he's sitting around reflecting. He's looking at them. Although you were so fully convinced of the benevolence of the Father of mankind, your way of knowing says that God did this. It's an inalienable right. For real? Really? All right, well, let me drop something else on you then, Chief. That you should at the same time counteract his mercies. Meaning what? Oh, you God now. I see how your worldview work. Yes. Yes. In fact, yeah, please, you want to read from the quote, or you got an observation from the quote? Absolutely, no, go right ahead, go right ahead.
In studying this quote, weren't the founding fathers deists, meaning that they believed that God created the universe and then they just left it alone? So is that why the Europeans have their initial thought that they could just control America, or they had, divine rights to rule?
That's a very, very, very good question. Weren't indeed the founding fathers deists? Many of them. Later, God set the universe in motion and then backed up off it. Whatever y'all do. So there's notion of free will, and we're going to see that even in the founding principles of many of the British colonies. We're going to see Carolina, for example, John Locke writing the principles. We're going to see Jefferson, certainly Jefferson, wrestling with this in his in the work that he did on the Virginia House of Commons. Eventually, Notes on the State of Virginia, and all these things. Right. So the idea then that yes, we are in charge of our destiny, that is not foreign to African ways of knowing as well. But the African ways of knowing also speak to the idea that the fundamental. I'm thinking now about the Yoruba. The Yoruba who would argue that it is Iwa, that you're here to improve. Dr. Badagation gave a great lecture on this yesterday at freshman seminar. Your character. The only reason you're on earth is to work on your character. And that God is constantly aware and mindful. But, as the Yoruba would say, no Orisha, no divine spirit no Orisha without Egungun, without your ancestors. So the whole idea is that God, you may not talk to Oludumare, you may not talk to Nyame, you may not talk to Amun, to give different names from African spiritual traditions, Okulokun. You may not talk to the creative spirit that put everything in motion, but you saw your grandmother. You saw your grandfather, you saw your parents, you saw the people who gave birth to the people who gave birth to you. If you were lucky, you saw the people who gave birth to them. And so you know your responsibility, and you can imagine your grandchildren. You can imagine your great-grandchildren. So you have to have historicity, a vision of the future. And so what Banneker is saying is that in your ways of knowing, you declare that this thing is a divine proposition. How can it be a divine proposition? Then you turn around and basically defecate on it by detaining, by fraud and violence, so numerous a part of my brethren under groaning captivity and cruel oppression, that you should at the same time be found guilty of that most criminal act, which you professedly detested in others with respect to yourselves. That's an African. That's an African who would not bow down to enslavement. That's a maroon. That's not a runaway. That's somebody who's declared his space. Because the philosophy of Maroonage is about declaring your space to be human in the world on your terms and working with other humans to build a better world. That's basically what Maroonage is. So he's looking at Jefferson like, dude, I'm not going to punch you in your face, but I am going to tell you this. So what did Jefferson do? He looked at the letters and then passed them off to somebody else. Well, you can't hang? Yeah, because you can see the future, and you know if you get your part right, they're going to build a big monument to you down there. And they may put my name on a high school, but trust me, they're not going to put it in the curriculum in this way. Because the Maroon spirit continues to live. Because that's what Maroonage does. It passes from genealogy to genealogy. That's why on July 4th, they continue to talk about the revolution. Yes, ma'am. Let me look and see what time we got. We're doing good for time. What was it say? Mm-hmm.
As we continue to look
that have historical memory.
Mm-hmm. And people have historical memory. The question is, how far back does it go?
How far back does it go?
Sure.
And we want to teach our children in the future. We want to continue to teach ourselves and our children, but they don't have the opportunity because we're still learning. So if we think about this, isn't that a human right?
What's it? To learn?
To learn, not just to learn, but to learn our history, or not our history, because our history is human history, but to know the truth. Isn't that a human right ultimately?
Well, that's a good question. Is it a human right for us to know our history, to know human history, for people to know their history? Certainly, Jefferson, Adams, Banneker, Phyllis Wheatley, whose name was Fatima before they put her on the ship named the Phyllis, and she was bought by the Wheatleys. They would probably all agree that that might be what we might call a natural right. But in terms of a social right, in terms of the governance structure we create for ourselves and the social structures that we live in, that is up to the people who live in those structures, which is why Maroonage is also about political protest. Not just political protest, but the declaration of space. In fact, let's move very quickly as we think about that, because that's a very good question, to Maroonage. Let's find out Maroonage. Maroonage in North America. No, actually I want to go over for a second to, yeah, that's right, that's right. Diverging political cultures, bottom of page 19. See.
President Trump on the balcony.
Let's look at this.
I mean, so much was going on.
Bottom of page 19, last two sentences, last two lines rather, one sentence over two lines. The resistances to slavery were the principal grounds for the radically alternative political cultures that coalesced in the black communities of the 18th and 19th centuries, the era of revolutionary, liberal, and nationalist impulses among Europeans in North America. So what's going on during that period? Revolutionary impulses, liberal impulses, nationalist impulses. You got the French Revolution that's going to brew up. You're going to have the so-called American Revolution that's going to brew up. But the biggest, in fact, the one that we are focused on as a kind of example of what African people are aspiring to and doing to is actually on map 36 in terms of the governance structure. What's going on at the same time, roughly, in the African governance structures in the Western Hemisphere? The Haitian Revolution, exactly right. The Haitian Revolution is a form of African Maroonage and governance that explodes on the scene at the same time that this liberalism and nationalism and this move to Republican representative democracy is taking place in the Western Hemisphere. The Africans are doing the same thing. So people say it's the first black republic. No, It's African Maroonage that finds itself in a particular social structure. Don't put no adjective black over the republic. Forget that. Think about the governance structures of African people. But yes, the right In fact, this is why I love that Dessalines the Ferocious, after Toussaint Louverture got sold out by Napoleon and those cats who tricked him and he got to France, they put him in prison where he died. Dessalines comes up and says, you know what? We write this Haitian Constitution, everybody in Haiti is black. That's it. White people like, us too? If by black, what did they mean by black? Not just phenotype. In fact, not phenotype. It was the idea that there would be fundamental equality. Did they live it out? Not completely. Did the social structure try to prevent them? Until this day. Until the rise of what Naomi Klein would call disaster capitalism. Earthquake, time to do something we want to do all along, whether it be New Orleans or Port-au-Prince. But did they declare in their documents equality in a way that anyone even declared in the U.S. Constitution? Absolutely. And Dessalines said, in order to get rid of this race thing, we're all black, unless you choose not to be, at which point you're an enemy of the state. Because there should be a right. There should be a right for all of us to live out our human potential. That's in the Haitian Constitution. He was old poor Haiti. What you mean? Poor Haiti. Right, because poor in this social structure, but in terms of their ways of knowing and the other categories we're going to put up in a second, not poor at all. In fact, it was the defiance, the Maroonage of Haiti that led to the inspiration among African people throughout the hemisphere. Julius Scott's dissertation, The Common Wind. It's never been published as a book, but he published several chapters of it in a recent book on Haiti, and there have been a number of books on Haiti recently. But the thesis is clear. Africans throughout the Western Hemisphere knew about the Haitian Revolution. David Walker is talking about it in the 1820s in his appeal. Mariah Stewart alludes to it in the speeches she gives in Boston. Prince Hall, that brother from Barbados, you'll find him tapping into it in the Northeast, in New England. So you see this very important impulse. But the right to this day of human beings to learn, to know their history, to contribute their understandings to the forward flow of human history, that's a right that has to be a social right. And it's not one that's guaranteed because people fall short so often. So yeah, that's something we continually struggle for. And the fact that we're struggling for it today speaks to the fact that whether you want to call it an imperfect union in the United States, whether you want to call it the ongoing progress of human civilization in another context, what is clear is this: it remains a struggle. So we have to remain in that struggle. Yes.
I mean, national right and social right, but I think you explained it between social structure and governance, but I might be wrong.
Well, no, in fact, we're going to, that's actually a good question. We'll probably get to that as we get to framing questions for and going forward. The idea of national identity speaks to this idea that by birth you get certain rights, you inherit certain rights. That's the whole mess here now, right? About finding a birth certificate for Barack Obama. Like, come on now, can y'all just let that go? No, right, because the nation is more than a set of rules, it's an idea. And in terms of national rights, there's a notion of being born. At least one configuration is a notion of being born. So, go ahead, please, absolutely, absolutely.
I can't imagine that under...
Say they try to start this huge controversy about Barack Obama not being born a United States citizen, even though his opponent was born in Panama, which was at the time a U.S. territory.
U.S. Canal Zone.
U.S. Canal, yeah.
Right. Exactly, which means you're exactly right. Which means what? You can call attack on people depending on what your vision of America is. And the vision of America is a contested vision. Because this country is comprised of, and I say country, not nation, this state has a number of people in it who are citizens and the people who aren't citizens, but the people who live in this in the boundaries of this state, who live in this country, come from a whole lot of different places with different kinds of ideas. The thing that holds this state together is common purpose, but the common purpose isn't always the thing that we might claim it to be or think it is. So yes, let's put the rest of these categories up. So we have notions of ways of knowing. And I gave the Banneker example. So let's go forward. Let's get our last three categories up, and then we'll continue. And then, of course, on Thursday, we will go even further, because on Thursday, I think we're going to spend time on the Seminole Wars, which is a great example of African maroonage here in the North American continent. Because, of course, Florida was colonized by which European colony? Spain. And it's a beautiful thing. African people are always migrating. This book just came out, The Warmth of Other Suns. Before the mid-19th century, black people lived pretty much exclusively in the United States South, with a handful of people outside. Meaning up to the period of the Civil War, about 4 million people at that time. But by the end of the 19th century, you still have about 90% of all African people in this country lived in the South. Between the end of the 19th century and the middle of the 20th century, it became almost 50-50. Why did black people leave the South? They wanted the cold, they wanted the hawk to kiss them and get them ashy elbows in Chicago. Opportunity, right? Opportunity means opportunity not to have to fight every day. In the same way, I gotta sleep with a rifle all across my lap, like Rosa Parks said her daddy did. I got to, so if the Klan kick in the door waving the 4-4, I'm gonna pump them full of lead. This isn't Rosa Parks, who ended up sitting down on the bus in Montgomery. Her earlier memory, I'm laying there with my daddy got the rifle. Let's be clear. I'm trying to move, because Rosa Parks ended up living in fact, her funeral was held in West City. Some of y'all from there. Detroit. So the migrations come out. There you go, you gotta rep it, no question. This is Howard, after all. Every state in the union, almost every country in the world represented, probably in this room. But the whole point is this. Anybody wants to know, y'all go home and say, why y'all go to all black college? First of all, it's never been all black. The first population of Howard University student body was in fact not, predominantly black. Including whites, including white women, number one. And number two, in terms of diversity, never worked at a more diverse place than Howard. But just because you got a lot of chocolate and peanut butter and, French vanilla and everything, they're like, it's all black. No, not even hardly. But the whole point is this. What you see then is those migration patterns don't just go from the U.S. South to the U.S. North. They go anywhere away from these problems. Sociologists call them push factors. They push out. But the whole point of migration is very important because as people move, what you also see, they carry with them the memories of where they came from. And so those movements not only take place there, they take place from the Caribbean to North America. But they follow what people think is their best chance to live a better life. So Florida is colonized by the Spanish. And guess what? The Spanish got different attitudes toward enslavement than the British. So you know what Negroes in Georgia trying to do? Where they trying to get? To Florida. So you see when they put Fort Mose up that talks about in chapter 1, what was Fort Mose? I remember? Maroon community, a maroon town, they call it a town. A maroon city, a maroon governance structure. Negroes trying to get to Fort Mose. It's almost like those Negroes were trying to get to Mexico in the early part of the 19th century before they created something called Texas. It's Texas, right? Anybody from San Antonio and who's been to the Alamo? Remember the Alamo. Why? You should remember. Again, in our game called Intellectual CSI. Let's go to the crime scene and see that there are different ways to view this story. There were Africans, enslaved Africans. Jim Bowie had somebody with him at the Alamo. What's he thinking? He said, how did I get here? What would you have been thinking? I'm about to die. And these cats in Santa Anna's army, whether it be because they're humanitarians or not, probably not, because it's good politics for Santa Anna, sure. But one thing's for sure, Mexico got a different attitude toward enslaving Africans than this Republic of Texas or the United States does. For all we know, that brother died with this on his lips. Wait, take me with you. But I don't speak no Spanish. Damn. But what we know for sure is that there are different ways of knowing, different ways of viewing, and we can't look at an American national narrative, everybody got the same perspective, particularly when that narrative continues to put black people in a position where we're some kind of junior partners to the American project. Cases to be pitied. Well, no pity. In fact, what does Banneker say? You the pitiable one, TJ. For real. Let me get back to my almanac with this African knowledge. I just wrote this off to you because clearly you're not going to listen, but it doesn't matter. I'm going to give you a chance to listen. This continuing petitioning, which goes us back then to the page, as we say. You see that black folks, we're on 19, right? On 20 now. During the era of revolutionary, liberal, and nationalist impulses among Europeans, among blacks, the rule of law among blacks and the black governance structures, various structures, and meaning what? Enslaved Africans on these plantations, whether it be in Maryland, whether it be in Virginia, whether it be North and South Carolina, whether it be in Georgia, we see the differences, don't we? The farther south you go, the more harsh it is. By the time you get to Pennsylvania, it's a William Penn, that was an enlightened colony. There were some Quakers who said slavery was bad, but Pennsylvania had plenty of enslaved Africans. In the city of Pennsylvania, in the city of Philadelphia, and also west. In fact, James Carville, many years ago, said Pennsylvania is Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, and Alabama in between. So let's be clear about plantation slavery, even that far. And you know the Mason-Dixon line separates Delaware from Pennsylvania, meaning what? We're in the South. So what you see then is enslavement throughout those colonies, except New England, that doesn't have the same kind of enslavement, doesn't have the same numbers, and doesn't have the same attitudes. What you see then is among blacks in the colonies, the rule of law was respected for what? For its what? Y'all see it on page 20? One more time. Power. For its power. Rather than for any resemblance to justice or a moral order. Let's go on Georgia Avenue right now. Police stop you. Officer, I'm so glad you stopped me. Do I have a taillight out? Thank you. I want to be a safe citizen. No. What you want, man? The police are your friend. Yeah, okay. Respect for the power of the law, rather than any sense that the law is right all the time. What is this ambivalence of attitudes in governance structures among African people of law enforcement? What KRS-One say many years ago? Officer, overseer. Meaning what? What are we talking about? We're talking about an arm of the state in place to maintain order, which is important in a society unless your investment is different. At which point, if you're the problem, there's a problem. Who are you? You're a problem. I'm 6 years old. Yes, but you talked out of turn, so I'm sending you to the principal's office with a pink slip. Okay, now the teacher's the police. Everybody in the building the police, so I might as well get started. Then you look up 10 years later, and this child is waiting for Superman. I'm not waiting for Superman. Superman the police. I know Superman. Not waiting for him. I'm against it. In fact, if Superman come in here today, I got some kryptonite in my fist. There's an attitude that comes from this relationship that Cedric Robinson roots in the experience of Africans, particularly Maroonage, toward the social structure. Let's put our other categories up as we wend toward the end for today, because these are the 6 categories that we continue to apply. And for the moment, and I'll make a quick division, and then we'll close up for today. So we got our social structure. You ask yourself the question, what is the social structure that is in place for the period that we're studying? What is the governance structure? Meaning, what systems of governance, of self-regulation, do Africans create in that time? But black people were in slavery. Yeah, you don't think on the plantation everybody didn't know who was married to who? Or who went with who? Or whose baby was who? Or who got sold from who? Or who said, if we ever get free, them 2 mules is mine because I done plowed every acre over here? There's a book called The Claims of Kinfolk that actually documents that. After the Civil War, black people went to the government and was like, that's my crystal pitcher, for real. Yeah, because I poured water out that 25 years, and we said if we ever got free, everybody know. Like, how do you don't have no papers? I got a governance structure. Don't you want this comb? I sure do. Break, put in the ground. I done combed your hair for 40 years. I don't want this comb. But I pretended like I did. So a lot of the scholarship looks like black people were enjoying slavery or somehow had some kind of relationship. No, you never asked them. Ways of knowing. What ways that African people have, belief systems, ways of viewing the world that they brought into that space to give some sense of order. How come black people didn't go crazy? Because black people did not look to the West for their ideas of God or the divine. Whether it be in Haiti with Vodun, whether it be in Brazil with Candomblé, whether it be in Cuba with Santa Rita, whether it be in the United States with the church, the black church, the Negro church. All of them bound together by a notion that this world is not my home. I'm just passing through. You call me a slave, I feel sorry for you. In fact, Fannie Lou Hamer told Hubert Humphrey, who was the vice president of the United States, whatever that means, she says, Mr. Humphrey, this is after the convention in 1964, after she questioned America. She said, Mr. Humphrey, I'll pray for you. You know what he did? Bust out crying. You're the vice president. That don't mean nothing. Who's the authority in this relationship? I'm not coming to you for my humanity. In fact, I feel bad for you. Kind of like Banneker kind of felt bad for Thomas Jefferson, but not bad enough to put on some chains. Like his granddaddy said, I ain't gonna be no slave, and I ain't converting to Christianity. What's the next category? Science and technology. We just gave a little taste of that with Banneker. And some of his whole scientific logic wasn't African, but you clearly see a distinct African root. So, gotta get this. Take the chain. Thanks, man. Clean it off. All right. The science and technology that African people brought with them is the agrarian science. The agrarian science from Africa. The architectural science that went into building a lot of the buildings that we now see in Charleston, South Carolina, New Orleans, Louisiana. It also went into military science. This is a book I was telling you about last week, John Thornton's book, Warfare in Atlantic Africa, 1500 to 1800. They couldn't figure out how these Maroons were attacking the plantations. Why? These Negroes have been fighting each other in Africa. Segu, the great kingdom, the last days of Songhai. You have African cavalries. You got Africans on plantations in the Caribbean, on plantations in North America. You know what? Here, give me the horse, man. Give me the horse. You got me enslaved. I come from a family of horse breed. You wouldn't know that because I'm having this conversation with my boy who you did not separate on the boat. We both wore off. Can you see this man, these cats be killing these horses. So just back up. And they do a little ritual because they both part of the same society, rites of passage. Then they go break the horses. Now, 150, 200 years later, we read it, we talk about all the great, all the great innovations that came out of the moment that preceded the Industrial Revolution. Whatever. Do you know how many of those were based on African genius applied to science, meaning how to conceptualize the world and try to think about the world in terms beyond just the human experience, in technology, how to apply that knowledge to the solving of problems in real time? How you get the seeds out the cotton? Why are you asking Eli Whitney? I'm the one who got to pick it. This is what y'all do. Okay, now Whitney writes it down. Patent, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Yeah. Okay. Let me see your hands. Boy, you ain't gonna pick no cotton. Go ahead and sit down. You on the porch with a mint julep, watching and writing. The next category, social structure, governance structure, ways of knowing, science, technology. What's the next one? Movement and memory. As black people move from place to place, from Alabama to Detroit, from Barbados to New York City, from Haiti to Toronto, how do people, well, probably more appropriately from Jamaica to Toronto, but the whole point is, as people move, what are the memories they carry with them? It's many Negroes in here to this day that will not split a pole, will not step on a crack. People call that superstition. Africans might call it an awareness of the ancestors, an awareness of forces beyond the ones you can see. They will have somebody link up and say, we shall overcome. Well, it's a quaint song with a civil rights movement. No, it's a governance structure. We're together, and guess what? God is on our side today. God on your side too, if y'all all want to be black. What do you mean? Be black skinned? No, like Dessalines said, subscribe to the common idea of humanity. That is at the core of Maroonage. And then finally, after you've moved and passed it on, what are the things that you do that constitute what? Cultural meaning making. In other words, how do you make meaning in your culture? Your songs, the dress, the speech. How do we do that? How do we say that we're forever free? So, we wind to a close for today. I want to linger a little bit on Maroonage and set the stage again. We'll continue this conversation on Thursday. Map 13. After Europe has created, and these are the two categories, you have pre 1500 and post 1500. This is not a good visual representation because these are not co-equal. This is forever yesterday.
So I just took this.
So pre-1500, these two things are the same. So you have the large state structures, Kemet, Kush, you have Monomotapa, you have Merowe, Aksum, you have Ganamali, Songhai, Kanem Bornu, you have the great the Nguni language formations in Southern Africa and the states that they form. But you also have the House of States, you have the village societies of the Igbo, you have all these different places which are the governance structures of Africans prior to enslavement and the social structures. Then enslavement comes. And all those people get on boats. Some of all those people. You can't take them all. Why? Africa's got 1 billion people in it right now on the continent itself, and another billion if you count us. And I'm including the Africans who speak Spanish and French. Because blacks and Latinos is a very iffy proposition. It's not either or, it's both and. Are you Latino? Yes. Are you black? Yes.
And then it goes right
through
your system, your
Sonia Sotomayor, they got African blood? Yes. They have African traditions? Yes. You know what Sonia Sotomayor's nieces call her?
Break it down.
Nana.
So after it's
that's an icon phrasing, and I butchered it because it's tonal.
Normally would.
Anybody know your name?
I like to fry it up
Nana.
with ghee.
You say Nana. That didn't come from England. So I look at Sotomayor like, give you a DNA test. Now let me catch you going into a bodega doing some Santeria, or at least I know you know what it is. Winnie what? Those are the traditions that came from the African spiritual traditions. Then you get on the boat and they become Bodun and Santeria and the Holiness Church and the Shango Baptist and the Shatter Baptist and the Rastas and everything else you can imagine as Africans apply their ways of knowing. The science and technology that people had that built the pyramids, that dammed the rivers, that created the great structures in West Africa and the agricultural systems are then applied to build New Orleans and Memphis and Charleston and all those places. And also to take a string and stick it on another piece of wood and stick electric cord into the wall and put that cord up into that piece of wood that you got and take the sounds of Mali and create muddy waters. And it come from, troubadour. Oh, tell me about That's a different conversation, all the way through Jimi Hendrix, and then it creates what we now call rock and roll. So Africana Studies isn't just a study of black people, it's a study of the African contribution to the world. And it comes from the philosophy, the governance structure of Maroonage. I ain't no slave. I ain't gonna convert to the ways of knowing that I find here. And if you even think I converted, I'm still gonna put Africa in it. Very important. Moving in memory, here's where we fall short. Because we make the culture, but then we don't always remember. And it's the memory of Maroonage that allows us to see that what put Barack Obama in the White House was Maroonage. How many Negroes who ain't never voted before in their life voted for Barack Obama? I stood in line in Philadelphia 5:30 in the morning. I was number 4 in line. 2 80-year-old women and a black man in front of me who said, I ain't voted since Wilson Good ran. And then they tried to say that my address wasn't the right address. So I was like, F y'all, I ain't gonna vote no more. Until today. I was like, dude, where are you coming from? This is a maroon in terms of, I'm not participating. So Maroonage isn't always the most enlightened philosophy, but one thing is undeniable, it is a healthy suspicion of the state. And guess what? Unless Barack Obama flashes a sign to them cats that I'm still got some maroon in me, may not get reelected. Because see, the Maroons may stay at home this time. Because their investment in the state is always conditioned. If you ain't gonna do what you said you was gonna do, dude, I don't care who the president is. You understand why we voted for you? Because we thought maybe, but guess what? I don't have no investment in the state. I got an investment in you. And if you sell us out, forget Sasha, Malia, Michelle, your mother-in-law. They good. But they ain't the president. I'm talking about you. So guess what? Whatever. We'll see what Mitt Romney does. New Gingrich, whatever. Can't get no worse for us. And guess what? The Tea Party think it's bad now? Go ahead with it. So, let us wind here. I don't know if anybody has any last comments or questions. I think we're right on time. You got something? Sir? Okay. All right. Anybody? Yes, yes, yes. And we'll wind from here.
I actually had a few questions about the text.
Yes, ma'am.
Actually in chronological order.
Yes.
Robinson states, or he gives facts that African presence was in Florida in the early 1500s. So when did African peoples really begin to arrive on the North American continent?
Good question. When did Africans arrive on the North American continent? Well, we know for sure that we don't know the exact answer to that. Map 9 is Africans in the Caribbean, Central America before Christopher Columbus. Not much on the North American presence, but we know that at least as far back as the early 16th century. This little dude, a cat named Little Stephen. Y'all probably read about him in elementary school. Estevanico, right? Who came with the Spanish. Clearly Africans came with the Spanish. In fact, Pedro Alonso, Nina. Allegedly with Columbus on the boats. So that's that Me Too history black people do. We were there too. Like, well, okay, yeah, very nice. But yes, we don't know the answer to that. But we also know that when the British came, we have Jamestown, early 17th century, you have Africans as well who are coming in. That's the work, of course, of Lerone Bennett's book, Before the Mayflower. So yes, yes. No, 1607 for Jamestown, yes. Mm-hmm. Go ahead, yeah.
Oh, also.
And then we'll win with this.
For the last page on page 20,
yes.
Robinson speaks of the rule of law.
Yes.
Does he mean literally the rule of law, or is he speaking metaphorically about the white social governance structure?
Both. Both. The rule of law, metaphorically, meaning the whole idea of the presence of law, and also literally, because remember what we talked about last week? When it was passed, the 13th Amendment, and it's still the language in there, slavery, right? Slavery, and involuntary servitude, except what? Or crime, of which the party should have been duly convicted, has been abolished. Meaning what? Slavery abolished? I don't know. Ask them cats in the joint whether it's been abolished. So yes, it's metaphorical, but also literal depending on the context. All right, y'all. Since we won't see you all again before this, if you all not doing anything this afternoon, Charles Fuller, the brother who wrote A Soldier's Play. Y'all ever see the movie A Soldier Story? This is Denzel, all the cats, right? He's going to be on campus over in the chapel at 3:30, and also at 1 o'clock he's doing a master class over in the theater. Is that wrong? I'm not sure. Okay, very good. So with that in mind, I guess we'll meet up on Thursday morning. Don't forget y'all bi-weekly essays, and we'll continue on at that time.